Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles and on this episode we're doing a top 10. Topic of the top 10? Top 10 ECW talents that should go into the WWE Hall of Fame. Now the reason I made this list and the reason I'm thinking of this, just a little bit ago it was announced that WrestleMania 40 will be in Philadelphia. If you've been watching wrestling, you know that Philadelphia is the home of ECW. So what better time to put in some of the ECW legends into the WWE Hall of Fame? With all that being said, if you see people on this list, it's not necessarily just their ECW run. It's their combined career. But because they were ECW talents, that's why they're considered for this list. Starting off at number 10, the Blue World Order. Big Stevie Cool, the Blue Guy, and Hollywood Nova, aka Stevie Richards, Blue Meanie, and Nova. What started off as a one-off joke between three guys that were making parodies of wrestling. They had done the Blue Bloods, they had done Kiss, they had done the Fantastics. Caught on. And fans really jumped on this, right? This wasn't too long after the NWO itself started. And the fact that they were taking as a British term, taking a piss on it, or goofing on it this quickly, lampooning it, it made for really interesting television. And being there around the time and being there watching that, you seen just how popular that got, how quick. The BWO at one point was the biggest stars in ECW, and it's not hyperbole to say that. They were the ones that the crowd wanted to see. They were who they were cheering for. In a time where you had Terry Funk and Sabu and Raven and Tommy Dreamer, the Dudley Boys, the Eliminators, the Gangstas, you had a lot of really great talent in ECW, but the fans loved the BWO. And it's a gimmick that carried on. They did it in the WWE as well. The three members went on to success other places as well. Stevie Richards would go on to be Right to Center. Blue Meanie carried his Blue Meanie character. Nova would go on to be Simon Dean later on. But for that, I think they should go into the Hall of Fame. Now coming from that, our number 9. A guy that a lot of people don't really associate with ECW, but he was definitely a big part of the ECW history. And that's Dean Malenko. A lot of people look at ECW as a blood and guts, hardcore promotion with chairs and tables and all that stuff. There was a time where you had guys like Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero, and it would carry on. They always had what were known as wrestlers that could put on some of the best wrestling matches that have ever been seen. Malenko and Guerrero specifically would have a series of matches that are some of the best matches of the decade. I defy you to find me a match in the 90s in America, because there are some Japanese matches that are just as good, if not better. I defy you to find me an American match as good as the 2 out of 3 falls Malenko versus Guerrero match, which has been known as the Malenko-Guerrero Classic. Dean Malenko is a highly underrated wrestler. He's a guy that I absolutely love. I love his work here. I love what he did in WCW. Even his gimmick in WWE when he was a ladies' man kind of character, it still resonated. But a lot of people don't. He's kind of, with history, he's not looked on as much as an innovator or anything, but he absolutely was. He was one of the forebringers of the cruiserweight style that would infiltrate WCW and kind of influence the style that we have now. Without the Dean Malenkos of the world, we don't have the Daniel Bryans, the Kyle O'Reillys, guys of that nature. Dean Malenko is a direct influence on all those wrestlers. So for that and for all his accomplishments, I think Dean should be in the Hall of Fame. Our number 8. I know I can't talk about this induction without at least referencing it, so I'm going to in part of it. But I think woman should be in the WWE Hall of Fame. And yes, what I was talking about is the end of her life. She was part of the Chris Benoit murder-suicide as being his wife. And I get why WWE might not want to put her in because of that. However, you cannot blame woman, aka Nancy Benoit, Nancy Sullivan. You cannot blame her, or the Fallen Angel if you watched her in Florida. You cannot blame woman for someone murdering her. I don't think that she should be held out just because of what her husband did. Yes, her husband merits a Hall of Fame, and there's an argument for that. But woman herself was very accomplished as a valet/manager. If you think about it, she had to run in Florida with Sullivan's Army of Darkness as the Fallen Angel. She came into WCW as Robin Green, the admirer of Rick Steiner, that then morphed that character and turned on him and became woman. At one point, she managed the Four Horsemen. And in ECW, she goes on to manage, most famously in ECW, Sandman and Too Cold Scorpio. And at one point, woman was a manager of every champion in ECW, because Sandman was a world champion, Scorpio was a TV champion, and the two of them were tag team champions together. And it was by no small part of woman being part of the act. She had a lot to say and a lot to do in a lot of Sandman's matches. She would hold the cane for him, she would get involved, she would be the distraction, she would cause conflict between him and Tommy Dreamer, especially the famous angle where Sandman gets his eye, supposedly gets blinded. She was the catalyst of a lot of those storylines. She turned on Shane Douglas during this time, a very similar storyline. I just think that this would be a nice way to honor this absolute legend who didn't get to go out on her own terms. I think it would be great to have her in here. And I think it would be, with the Dark Side of the Ring coming out just a few years back now, and the way that people view her, and her seeming to get a more favorable outlook now, maybe it is time we put her in and ignore what her idiot husband did. Now, coming from that, our number 7. A man that the woman managed, the Sandman. Sandman is a 5-time ECW champion. And you'd be hard-pressed to find many wrestlers that associate with ECW more than the Sandman does. There are some that do just as much. Tommy Dreamer, the Dudley Boys, Sabu, Rob Van Dam. You automatically associate with ECW. However, no one exemplifies the ECW motif more than the Sandman. He was a beer-drinking, cigarette-smoking, cane-wielding bar fighter, basically. He was your everyman. He was a guy that worked construction. And he looked like the crowd. Famously, among me and my friends, my stepfather took me and my friend Jason to an ECW show in Camden at one point at the Camden, I forget what their baseball team, their name is, but at their baseball stadium. And this was one of his first times seeing ECW, and I believe it was definitely his first time seeing the Sandman. And at the event, the Sandman, all through the show, you would see he was in the crowd kind of interacting with people, but he had a party bubble, if you guys remember what that is. It's like kind of like a mini keg that you can buy at stores. It's a lesser version. I digress. Story goes on, Sandman gets absolutely wasted drunk. And my stepfather, who was a big drinker himself, said, I like this guy. That's my favorite wrestler because he's drunker than I am. And among me and my friends, that became a legendary story, because if you knew my stepdad, you'd understand he wasn't a mean drunk, he wasn't a bad drunk, he was just a guy that liked to have fun. And the Sandman was that kind of guy. It was a guy that resonated with those guys that worked hard and then wanted to come home and drink a six-pack of beer. That was the Sandman. And that's why he exemplified not only the fans, but the specific Philadelphia fan base. So I think if you're going to do a Hall of Fame, if there's any better time to put him in, I can't think of it, because this would be the time. If Sandman's ever going to go in the WWE Hall of Fame, this would be it right here. Now, coming from that, our number 6, another former multi-time ECW champion, the Human Suplex Machine, Taz. Taz won every championship there was in ECW and even created one of his own with the FTW title. He was a guy that I think, when I think of it in America, in North America, to me, the guy that brought the MMA style into pro wrestling and bridged that gap was Taz. He was a little bit before guys like Shamrock and Severn were doing. Severn was wrestling as he was working in UFC, but he was wrestling in a lesser capacity. And I'm not trying to disrespect Shamrock or Severn at all. He was wrestling on lesser shows than Taz was. Taz was the guy on what was a national show that had the UFC influence, the MMA influence. He's the first guy I legitimately remember bringing the tap out into wrestling, which is now ambiguous. Everybody taps out. That's the way you get out of a submission. It didn't used to be that way. And if people remember pre-UFC, pre the MMA influence, the referee would raise a guy's hand 3 times to see if they passed out, whether it be in the figure 4, whether it be in a camel clutch. They'd have to either verbally quit or pass out. The tap out became a thing because people seen it in MMA, and Taz is the first guy that incorporated it into wrestling. As far as I know. I might be wrong. If I'm wrong, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to find out that I'm wrong. But for all that, and what he did after, his commentary work, his short run in WWE, which wasn't as great as it should have been, I think Taz definitely deserves it. And I think he's a good candidate to go in there. Now, coming from that, our number 5, not only another multi-time ECW world champion, but Taz's biggest rivalry in ECW, Sabu. Sabu, to me, is an absolute legend. I think it's a shame that Sabu is not in the WWE Hall of Fame as it is right now. The style of wrestling that's prevalent now at the time of this recording, which is 2022, and has been for the last 15 plus years, can directly be traced back to Sabu. Sabu was a daredevil. He was high-flying, he was crazy, he was hardcore, he was willing to do anything. It would be like if you took all the best aspects of Darby Allin and meshed them with all the best aspects of Pac, and then gave him a character that resonated even more than both of those guys do, you would have Sabu. Sabu, I've seen it said, he would botch on purpose just to give his matches an air of just craziness. You wouldn't know what was going to happen. You never knew if he was going to hit that moonsault, or if he was going to miss, or if he was going to wipe out. Every move he did was a chance to see a guy either spectacularly succeed or spectacularly fail. And there's something to be said about that. Sabu to professional wrestling is what punk rock is to music. There was no rules. There was no limits. He did exactly what he wanted and made you feel that this guy is dangerous. In a time where everybody in the world watching wrestling knew that wrestling was scripted, they still did not know what Sabu would do. And they believed in the character, and they believed in Sabu. And he's just, to me, he's undervalued and underappreciated for just how important he is in the history of pro wrestling. And I think it's an absolute shame he's not in the WWE Hall of Fame as of yet, as most of these people are. But he's one of the most glaring omissions, in my opinion. Now, coming from that, our number 4, I'm going to cheat a little bit on this. Much like I put in the BWO, we know the WWE Hall of Fame puts in factions. So I put three guys together that individually would deserve it. So I put them together as their faction, and that's the Triple Threat, specifically the version with Shane Douglas, Chris Candido, and Bam Bam Bigelow. And Francine. You gotta add Francine in there. The Triple Threat did have other members. Benoit and Malenko were part of the Triple Threat at one point. Brian Lee was affiliated with the Triple Threat. Lance Storm was affiliated with the Triple Threat. So there were other members, but much like the WWE picks and chooses like they did with the Four Horsemen, they can either put in the full group like they did with DX, they put in every member of DX, or they can pick a specific version like the NWO. They didn't put in the whole NWO. They just put in the main parts of it. That's why I think if you look at this grouping, you have Bigelow, who was a WrestleMania a WrestleMania main eventer, a ECW World Champion, a champion in WCW. Shane Douglas, a multiple-time ECW champion, and arguably the biggest moment in ECW history was created when ECW went from Eastern Championship Wrestling to Extreme Championship Wrestling by Shane Douglas throwing down the NWA World Championship, which makes him a former NWA champion as well, and then rechristening the Eastern Championship Wrestling Championship the ECW World Championship. That was a lot to say. And outside of that, he was a WCW Tag Champion, a US Champion, Intercontinental Champion in WWE in his Dean Douglas gimmick, which the less said about that, the better. Then you have Chris Candido, who was a multi-time WWE Tag Team Champion as part of the Body Donnas, multi-time Tag Team Champion in ECW, and he would go on, I believe, he managed the Tag Team Champions in TNA. I might be wrong, I might be getting my TNA history wrong. And also Douglas would go on to have a good career in TNA too. All three of these guys, I think, merit induction on their own. But to make it easier on the WWE, and to make it not as uncomfortable since Candido and Bigelow have both passed at this point, you can have Shane Douglas and Francine accepted on behalf of the group and have that feel-good moment where they talk about Bigelow. You can bring Candido's brother Johnny up there, where they talk about being Bigelow and Candido and how much and how important they were. I know this is a little bit of a cheat, but I think all three of them deserve to be there, so that's why we're going to put them at number 4. Now, our number 3. If I were to say someone was probably the most unlikely other than Woman because of the issues there, and maybe Shane Douglas, it would be Raven. For whatever reason, and Raven has said this, so I'm not, saying anything that hasn't been said already, Vince McMahon just did not get the Raven character. There's also the point where he's been involved in the concussion lawsuit against the WWE, which happens. Take that all away. We're just going over deserving. He was a multi-time ECW champion. He managed the WWE, or WWF at the time, Tag Team Champions. He's a multi-time hardcore champion in WWE, which is a belt that really means nothing. A US champion in WCW, tag champion in WCW. One of the legendary characters in all of the history of ECW, NWA champion later in TNA. I mean, the guy's resume is better than about half of the people already in the Hall of Fame. But there's that setback. I think Raven is a revolutionary character, much like I said with Sabu, much like everybody on this list. His character was so different, yet it was not that much different, honestly. If you look at it, it's just the evolution of what Jake Roberts was doing. It was the evolution of what Kevin Sullivan did in the 80s. It was the evolution of that evil cult-like leader. And it was so integral to ECW. You had everybody on the periphery of that. The BWO came out of that. The Dudley Boys came out of that. Tommy Dreamer's career was basically made out of that feud. The Sandman going into that feud. I mean, the angles that they had in ECW are still looked at today as being revolutionary. The stuff with Sandman and his son, the stuff with Tommy Dreamer not being able to beat him, all of that. The Terry Funk match at Barely Legal. I mean, everything he did, holding down Stevie Richards to the point where Stevie breaks out in the BWO. The angles with Beal and McGillicuddy and all of that involved that. I absolutely love Raven. I think it's a crime that he's not even been considered for the Hall of Fame yet. And he definitely deserves to be in there, hence why he's on the list. Now, coming from that, our number 2, you cannot talk about Raven without talking about Tommy Dreamer. Tommy Dreamer is our number 2. And he just barely edges out Raven, and I kind of went back and forth about putting them together as a combination, but I kind of cheated with the triple threat, so I didn't want to do that again. Tommy is a ECW champion. He's a former ECW tag team champion. He's an ECW champion in the reboot in WWE. He was a hardcore champion in WWE. He ran his own promotion with House of Hardcore. He's worked backstage in both WWE and TNA, or Impact now. Tommy is the face of ECW. Tommy is the ultimate good guy. He was the guy, much like Ricky Steamboat, much like Hulk Hogan, that all of the fans believed in. They wanted to root for Tommy Dreamer. I mean, everything about him, and you just see the guy poured his emotion into everything he did. Was he the best wrestler in the company? No. Was he the most hardcore? No. Was he the best high flyer? No. But he was special. Tommy resonated with everybody else because everybody could understand Tommy Dreamer, the underdog, the guy that was fighting for ECW, the thing that all of us loved, and what it was. And if you weren't around at the time, the way ECW was positioned was it was us, ECW and its fans, including myself, versus the world, being WWF, WCW. And Tommy was the flag bearer. Tommy was the guy that carried the ECW flag and more proudly than anybody else that there was. Tommy is so ingrained in ECW and what ECW meant. I mean, he was there from the beginning to the end. He helped book with Paul Heyman at the end. He did so much stuff behind the scenes. He's carried the legacy on probably more than everybody else on this list. For that reason, I definitely believe Tommy Dreamer, the heart and soul of ECW, deserves to be in the WWE Hall of Fame. Now, before we get to our number 1, I do a little thing here on my top 10s called the best of the rest. Basically, it's people that were considered for the list but didn't quite make it. We'll go through these a little bit quick. First up, Too Cold Scorpio. We mentioned him with the Sandman being a tag team partner and tag champion. He was also a TV champion multiple times. He's a tag champion in WCW. He went on to have a great career at Noah. I believe he's still wrestling now. I've seen him last year. He was in a game on a Game Changer show. Scorpio is another innovative guy that doesn't quite get the credit he deserves, but he absolutely helped define an era. Guys like him, Guerrero, Sabu, Rey Mysterio, the Luchadors in WCW helped change the style of wrestling. Good, bad, or indifferent, they changed the style and changed what a bigger guy could do. For that reason, I considered Scorpio. Unfortunately, he just didn't make the list. Now, next up on the best of the rest, Lance Storm. Lance is a guy that was successful in ECW, WCW, and WWE. And he wasn't never the guy at the top of the card, but he always was there. He was a tag champion in all three companies, I believe. He was a U.S. champion in WCW, Canadian champion, hardcore champion there, cruiserweight champion. At one point, he had all of the titles except for the world title in WCW. He was an intercontinental champion. I believe he was one of the European champions. Don't quote me on that, though. Lance Storm was an absolutely fantastic wrestler. Absolutely deserves to be in the WWE Hall of Fame. Just didn't quite make this list. Last but not least, on our best of the rest, Yoshihiro Tajiri. Tajiri was amazing in ECW. Very innovative. Again, I keep saying that. He was a tag champion. He was a TV champion. Then he goes to WWE. He's a cruiserweight champion. He was a European champion, tag team champion. Tajiri should go into the WWE Hall of Fame just off of the segments that him and William Regal did. If that's all he did in his career, he would deserve to be in the WWE Hall of Fame because that's some of the most entertaining stuff that WWE has ever done. Tajiri's an absolute legend, and he's still going as well. Definitely deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. Again, didn't make my list. Now, before we get into our number one, if you think I left somebody off, put someone down too low, put someone up too high, let me know in the comments. Smash that like button, share, subscribe if you haven't. And coming from that, our number one ECW person or persona to go into the WWE Hall of Fame, Paul Heyman. It could be argued that Paul Heyman, Paulie Dangerously, is the greatest manager of all time. And I know he doesn't like to use manager, he uses advocate, advisor. He's changed his thing over the years. But what he's been able to do, for the time he's been able to do this, Paul Heyman's been a manager in pro wrestling, a booker, a talent for 30 plus years now. Think of all the guys he's been associated with. The original Midnight Express, which is a very, very hot angle. Undertaker when he was very young. Sid Vicious when he was very young. The Dangerous Alliance, Rick Rude, Arn Anderson, Bobby Eaton, Larry Zbyszko. Stunning Steve Austin, who would go on to be one of the biggest stars that's ever done it. His booking in ECW and changing the landscape of professional wrestling, because ECW changed the landscape. ECW made the Attitude Era. ECW highly influenced WCW. The whole cruiserweight division started in ECW. ECW was the first company to really start bringing in the luchadors, and then WCW kind of took them from them. Everything he did in ECW is absolutely legendary. If he ended his career there, he deserved to be in the Hall of Fame. Goes back to WWE, becomes a manager again, famously for part of the Invasion angle, then managing Brock Lesnar. He's managed Kurt Angle, The Big Show, CM Punk, and now even Roman Reigns. If you look at all that talent, the one thing in common is they're all on the top of the card. Paul Heyman has been involved and has managed more world champions than any other manager in history. He's been in more world title programs for longer periods of time than any other manager. And I know it's blasphemy for some people to consider him better than Bobby the Brain Heenan. And I understand that. Bobby Heenan, to me, is the greatest manager of all time. But the longevity of Paul Heyman and what he's been able to do and how he's been able to keep himself relevant, he has to be in the conversation. And for all of that, plus what he did in ECW, plus what he's done behind the scenes in WWE, the guy definitely deserves to be in the WWE Hall of Fame as much or more than anybody else on this list. And I think if you put Paul Heyman in the WWE Hall of Fame in Philadelphia, it's the perfect place, because the Philadelphia fans, they're always going to love Paul Heyman. I'm always going to love Paul Heyman. Paul Heyman, to me, can never do any wrong. The people that loved ECW, the ECW fan base, look at him like the Messiah. He is the guy that gave us ECW. And I know there was ECW before Paul got there, but he's the guy that changed the trajectory, changed the vision, made ECW what it was. That's why he's the number one guy on my list. None of these guys, well, of course some of these guys would get in without him because there's a lot of hyper-talented people on this list. But everybody else on this list, their career was positively impacted by what Paul Heyman brought to the table. With all that being said, that was my opinion on the top 10 ECW talents that should go into the WWE Hall of Fame. Again, let me know what you think. Hit me up in the comments if you think I'm wrong. I'd love to hear your opinion. I'd love to hear people you also would consider. And if you made it all the way to the end, let's put an ECW in the comments, because that's what this is all about. It's all about ECW. My name is George Coles, and this has been another Heel Heat Top 10.